The views, comments, stories, and opinions within this podcast are my own or those of my guests, and in no way represent the views of the company or companies that I or we work for. Squawk Ident is an entertainment podcast dedicated to the journey and the challenges surrounding the life and career of Aviator Tony, an airline pilot currently flying for a legacy airline with close to 20 years on the flight line. This is episode 8 of Squawk Ident, recorded on the 7th of November 2019, from the Aviator Studios somewhere in Southern California. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Squawk Ident. Today marks a very special episode where Aviator Tony conducts his very first interview. Let's get right to the audio from that interview, and we hope you enjoy the show. All right, ladies and gentlemen, on this episode of Squawk Ident, we are very fortunate to have an aviator whose career progression has had its shares of both positive progressions and major pitfalls. He's a top-notch pilot, a King Air flight instructor, corporate captain, a Western grape bird strike survivor, a loving father, and just a class act guy. Please help me in welcoming to the show, Captain Roger.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
All right. So, Roger, we've known each other for what now? What's it been? 11, 12, 15 years?
I think it's probably coming up on about 15 because I think it's around 2005 or so.
Yeah. This is amazing to have, we met in this beginning of both of our aviation careers here as flight instructors in Chandler, Arizona. And we got some memories shared there with some flight students and our bosses at the flight school. And I mean, some pretty cool stuff. Yeah.
That is definitely a true story there, especially the bosses, coworkers, just starting out, being a lot younger and forming those first memories of joining the aviation workforce.
Yeah. So what really excites me about this interview is, first of all, I don't know if you know this, but you are my first interview on Squawk Ident. And this is really special because, we've kind of shared a lot of history together. We've shared stories over the years and, talk about knowing that the struggle is real. This is, we've taken different paths over the years. And, I always kind of use what you've gone through as a meter. And I hope you don't find offense to that. But, you've really had some pretty good ups and downs. And I was hoping to talk to you about that today.
Absolutely. It's definitely been an interesting road. I'm honored to be here. Just for you to ask and knowing that I'm your first guest, I don't, we'll see how it goes. Happy to, share some of my stories or with your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about how you got started. So from what I understand, UC Davis graduate, right? Taking nutrition, kind of on that road to follow in the family footsteps and get into the medical field. And then something happened and you decided to go into aviation. What made you do that?
2 words: organic chemistry.
So it was that bad, huh?
It was that bad. I had always enjoyed aviation. My dad was a doctor. He's a family practitioner, and the Air Force had paid for his medical school. And we lived in Guam I was born at Travis Air Force Base, and then we moved to Guam for a few years. And Guam's kind of in the middle, not kind of, but is in the middle of the ocean. And if you want to go anywhere, you have to fly. And I always loved flying. Growing up, I loved flying, but from a career, I never thought about going into it as a career. And then I went to Davis. I was on the pre-med track, and organic chemistry was that bad. I knew it was not going to be good for me when the average on the first midterm we took was a 25%.
Oh my gosh.
I got a 43, but at that point, I didn't want to study that hard, and I had to do some introspection and look at Roger, maybe if you don't want to do organic chemistry here your second year of college, are you really going to make it all the way through medical school? Because while I'm a fairly bright guy, I just didn't want to put the time and effort into it, and it was at that point that, well, if you're not going to go into medicine, what are you going to do? And so I went back, well, what are some things that you enjoy? And flying was the other thing that I thought I would enjoy. I had never really done it other than riding in the back of military airplanes primarily. My family never flew anywhere. And I went down to the local airport and I said, I want to learn to fly. And they said, well, you need
Yeah.
to go get a medical. I said, well, okay. And that medical cost me $70. And at that point, I had spent money on it and I was going to see it through. Now, here we are. And so that was 2003, I guess. So here we are 12 or 13 years later.
Yeah.
Still trying to get a run of it.
So when you decided to get into aviation, I mean, that's a pretty big leap. And I know it's scary for a lot of people, especially young men or women that are looking at a career in aviation and just think, wow, look at they get to fly airplanes and the glamour of someday working for, whatever that's going to be, whether it's corporate or cargo or even an airline. So what is the first step? Like, what is the turning point other than going and just saying, okay, I'm going to get my medical and I'm going to get started? What was your track? What was your journey? We all have kind of a little bit of a different spin on it, but what was your first flight school like?
My first flight school, it worked out really well for me. When I was at Davis, which is just a little bit to the west of Sacramento, college town. There's a little airport down there. I think it's 3,000-foot strip, 50 feet wide. And I simply went down there, and it worked out because it was only a couple miles from where I was going to school. Because I went to school full time, I still graduated, and I decided to do flying while I was still in school full time. And basically, when I had time outside of class, is when I went down. I did the whole program 61 while I was in school, part 61, and basically going to school, getting a degree in nutrition, and then going to the airport and flying around for a couple hours and coming back and going to biochemistry or whatever my next class was. It took me about 9 months to get my private pilot certificate. Then the summer, that was it. I got my ticket over Easter or spring break. And then the next school year, I went back to do my instrument rating. My last year of school, I finished that up in about 4 months. Got my instrument ticket at winter break. And then I just started doing some time building again, while I was going to school, while I was working, trying to fund the whole process. And then kind of from there, I carried on. And after I graduated and did the fast track program in order to get, all the way through the CFI so I could start getting paid to fly instead of having to shell out for that money or for that flight time.
Sure. And so you primarily were in what kind of airplanes? Was it Cessnas or Pipers or what was it?
Yeah, I flew a Cessna 152 until I had to do my instrument. And then the Cessna 152s were not instrument certified. And I worked my way up into the Cessna 172 Heavy.
Nice. Well,
she was a beast back then.
Well,
to me,
I remember the truck. Remember the truck? That Seneca one.
That Seneca
was the number one. Yeah.
Yeah, that was, we'll just call it the truck.
The truck.
There's some other stories behind that airplane, but
it was like flying a semi truck, man. It was so, oh man, underpowered and just heavy and
heavy on landing. You had to grab that wheel and give it 2 big trim wheels up because otherwise you're going to plow the nose wheel into the ground.
Oh, that's right. You remember? Was that with you when we went to Williams Gateway that one night and you said, watch this, and you grabbed the trim wheel and just spun it back like 4 times and it touched down perfectly right in the flare. And I was like, wow, that's a good one.
That was probably us. I remember we did that a couple times, and I remember flying that airplane around and doing instructing in that.
Yeah.
Teaching one of the instructors over there.
Yeah, that was the trick with that Seneca. If you didn't grab that trim wheel and spin it back 2 or 3 times, right before you flared, it was gonna be a tough landing, wasn't it?
Ugly,
Yeah.
ugly.
Well, so your progression as a flight instructor was great. That's when we met. I think we hit it off right away. I mean, at that time, my daughter was just born, or I think Julie was pregnant and she was gonna have Mia, and, you know, we didn't trust many people with our child. We had mom and dad, we had her mom and dad, and then we had Roger, who was the only person that we trusted with our daughter. And you hooked us up a few times and watched our daughter. And why is that? What was it that we saw in you? Was it because you were the oldest of how many sisters?
Well, what you saw in me, I will never know. Yeah, I'm the oldest of four. I have three younger siblings, and also both my parents were the oldest in their families, and so I have quite a few cousins, and they're all younger than me, just because both my parents happen to be the oldest in their family as well, and so they didn't have any brothers or sisters that had kids before them, and I'm paving the way, showing everybody else what not to do, as I like to say.
Well, I tell you, we hit it off, and I just saw something not just with your character, but with your work ethic, and it really showed on the flight line as well. And I remember a lot of your students uh, would come to me and just give you nothing but praise at that time. It was a really good time, I think, for any aviator when you're flight instructing, because you're learning and you're teaching and you're kind of, you've mastered a craft when you are able to teach it to someone else. And when you teach it well and the feedback is nothing but positive, that's a huge accomplishment. And I just have to commend you for doing such a great job at that time in your career. Um, in that phase, you were just in an amazing place with great feedback. And man, it just talk about good history, good stories there.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And, that's one of those things that I always have believed in. Have your own integrity, work hard, and things should work out for you.
Absolutely. And so you progressed. Now, I remember both of us went to go interview at a regional that we both interviewed the same day, flew out together. And after a period of time, we got the little letter, the little envelope in the mail saying, thank you, but, try again in 6 months. And I know I felt kind of hurt and devastated, but at the same time, I thought, well, it was only my first interview. And that's where our paths kind of, I think, went in two different directions. I, had a child at home, and I invested a lot of time and effort and money into changing a career to go from my previous career into an aviation career. And I just felt like I needed to get a job immediately. So, my history, I immediately put my application out to anyone that would hire or was hiring at the time. And you decided to stick it out, and eventually you made it into a 135 operator. Now, how did that happen?
Well, truth be told, I remember going to that interview with you and having such high hopes. Just walking through the terminal, especially for me, who was pretty young at the time. I was probably 22, 23 years old.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, yeah. Walking through the terminal with you, and those expectations, and to get the first dreaded thanks but no thanks letter, definitely was, okay, this is real. It's not just show up to the interview and you get a job. Um, yeah, that was quite the first experience there. In terms of how I got into the 135 world, in all honesty, I tried to take a shortcut. Um, if I'm really being honest, you went to the regional airline that you went to, and I left very soon after you did, and it was mostly because I wanted to work for I had this dream of working for Southwest. That was the only airline that I had really ever flown on. Mostly that was just because Southwest happened to be the airline that flew between Sacramento and San Diego, which is where I grew up, and Sacramento, where I had gone to school.
Yeah.
And Southwest had a requirement at that time of 1,000 hours of turbine PIC. And so my theory at the time was, as short-sighted as it was that if I went to this 135 outfit, I would spend a little bit of time in, a piston-powered airplane, and then I would upgrade into a turboprop, and that would I would then be logging turbine PIC.
Uh-huh.
Now, while that strategy was correct, because I got offered an upgrade after only 7 months, the many other things about it were not quite, I have nobody in my family or friends or anyone that had done aviation. I didn't really know what I was getting into. I was a little young and naive, and just that's when I really started learning about the industry, about what this industry was going to take in order to make it, and what was more truth versus what was more a little bit of some fiction that I was making up in my head, probably.
Sure. So, okay, so you went to the fly charter, and that I remember you calling me and telling me, what the heck did I get myself into? And so
I believe that.
And you're like, man, I'm sitting on the sofa all day in operations and they're not using me. Yep. And so then an opportunity came by for you to put in an application into another carrier, another regional carrier. I don't know if you want to divulge that information. If not, that's fine. But tell me a little bit about that.
So I was flying from Rifle, Colorado, and I was flying back to Denver, which was a run that I had done regularly at that time, and was climbing through 16,000 feet coming out of Rifle. And all of a sudden there was the cockpit got much quieter, and the airplane just kind of started yawing around a little bit. And as it had happened, the manifold pressure on the right engine had dropped off. I didn't have an engine failure completely, but what had happened was that the supercharger had failed on the right side. And so I had to make what amounted to an emergency landing in Aspen, because I wasn't going to be able to make it back to Denver over the mountains. And so I'm sitting in Aspen, and I checked my email, and I had an email for an invitation to come interview at a regional airline. And at that point, I had been there for about 7 months at the 135 carrier, flying cargo. And I was pretty much, please, yes, just get me out of here. This is not what I thought it was going to be. And let's take the next step. Maybe I do need to go and do what everybody else does and join a regional airline, which is eventually what I did do. I did go and I did do the interview. I was offered the position. And so back in 2007 is when I started my regional airline career.
And you found a good job flying for a kind of a new spin on that regional carrier's business plan, which was to do some branded flying. For those of our listeners that don't understand, a regional carrier usually is contracted out to a mainline carrier, like one of the big three, for example, like American, United, or Delta. And they'll contract out a regional flying to do a lot of their feed from some of the smaller airports into the hubs, so that passengers can, connect from some of the outlying areas that have smaller airports and maybe not as much traffic. So the airline that you were working for at the time decided to do some branded flying, and they were flying out of Ontario, California, which is in my neck of the woods. And it was very promising. Brand new airplanes, brand new regional jets. And then it quite didn't pick up as much as they expected, did it?
Well, there was a whole lot of other things that were going on at that time. But yeah, it was great at the time. I mean, I worked for ExpressJet Airlines, which, pretty much anyone can find out. They're the ones that did the branded operation. I was from Southern California. They had a Southern California base flying, like you just said, brand new airplanes. It wasn't the hub and spoke model. We could leave Ontario and not come back to Ontario for 4 days.
Yeah.
And not see, and which was pretty cool. The passengers were pretty happy. The pilots were pretty happy, and it was, I mean, it was great. I mean, for what it was worth at the time. Unfortunately, things started unraveling on a national scale. Even on an international scale, because there was kind of the perfect storm of a whole bunch of things that happened at that time.
So the economic downturn kind of really played a role in
the economic downturn and the oil. I mean, oil going up to $140 a barrel, and that's what shut that operation down. Yeah. And they stopped flying the branded flying. There was some other stuff. We were doing some Delta flying, and the Delta flying stopped. So that ended the California presence completely. And there was a pretty sizable reduction in force furlough that happened just over a year after I started. And I was, well into the group that did get furloughed. And so barely just over a year after I'd started is when I experienced my first furlough.
Wow.
In
the
industry.
Dreaded F word in aviation. A lot of people think it's something else. No, it's furlough. You never want to hear that. But you lived through it. You spent some time up in Sacramento, right? Doing some river rafting guiding, right?
I did. I had financed a lot of my flight training when I was in college doing river. I was a river rafting guide over the summers when I was going to school. And, in the end, back then I made more money taking people down the river and having fun than I would have flying airplanes. And so I did that for that summer. And, I kind of regret that,
Really?
I got married. Well, back then in my personal life, things were kind of colliding. I'd gotten the job at ExpressJet in 2007. I got married just under a year after I'd started at ExpressJet. The economy started tanking. I knew I was going to get furloughed. I knew that I had to make money. I went and I did the river rafting. But what that did was I got married. And then about 2 weeks after I got married, I then left for 3 months and went camping. I lived in a tent 2 weeks after I got married.
And it had to have been hard. I mean,
it was incredibly hard. It was not good. It was not good. I'll just kind of leave it at that.
So, you went through this struggle. You had to fall back on really what was maybe not even plan B, but plan C to make ends meet. And now here you are with new responsibilities, and not just married, but married with a couple kids from your wife at the time, from a previous marriage. So you were full on, not just like, oh, we're starting out and it's going to be tough, but no, you're a father, you're responsible. You've got a new bride. You've got a couple kids now that you're responsible for, or at least co-responsible for in some degree. And you had to go up to Sacramento and river raft because you got furloughed a year after you get hired. That's just a tremendous amount of weight for anyone to have to deal with. But how long did that last? That didn't last very long, did it?
Well, the rafting was for about 3 months, and then I came back home, which was in Phoenix at the time. But I came back to not having a job. At least I had been pulling a paycheck, but now I had come home and had no income. Didn't really know what I was going to do. As you may remember, you were fortunate enough that you got in earlier and you were working through that. But if you turned on the news, which I did because I had the time, it was doom and gloom. And
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, because even then, I remember talking to you about it and saying, "Man, just you should just come over to the regional airline that I was flying for at the time." And but they were furloughing too. I mean, it
there
wasn't just everybody was
was
furloughing at the time,
nobody was hiring, and actually everybody was furloughing. And I've got all this time on my hands, and I turn on the news, and you can't escape it. The stock market's tanking 1,000 points. People are losing their jobs. People are losing their homes. And it was a dark time in my life. Not really sure what I was going to do.
Right. And then through family member, through a happenstance of was it your parents that sent out a Christmas letter and kind of explaining what's going on with the family, and a friend of the family read the letter and said, "Well, wait a minute, my son, he's in the industry. Let's see if we can get our kids together and maybe there's something they can help each other out." And take it from there. What happened then?
That was pretty much how it happened. My parents wrote a Christmas letter out, and just friends of the family that they had for a long time. One of their kids was involved with another small feeder cargo carrier, and I was able to get an interview and actually get a job about 6 months. It was about 6 months after I'd gotten furloughed, and so I ended up taking that job. I mean, that was kind of no question. It was a no-brainer getting that job, and that was what I did. I flew feeder cargo operations again for the rest of my time being furloughed.
Yeah. And I remember you were flying a Beech 99, correct?
I was flying a Beech 99, yes.
Yes. So, a lot of up and down, but you were home every night. So quality of life was a little bit better, even though it wasn't the job that you really set out to start on. But, grateful that you were flying, grateful that you were able to find a position. And then just about 10 years, a little bit over 10 years ago today, something major happened to you. And I remember when you called me, did you call me from the hospital or just after you got out of the hospital? Or, I mean, what
I could
happened?
not answer that question. Who I called when at what point? It's kind of a little hazy. There might have been some drugs involved there.
Yep. Well, from the KOLD news in Arizona, about 10 years ago, and I'm going to let you kind of get into the details, but they said there that it was smooth flying for a pilot over the skies of Arizona until a bird came crashing through the front windshield of his twin-engine cargo plane. The impact left a bloody mess in the cockpit and forced an emergency landing in Show Low. The impact shattered the pilot's side windscreen. The pilot is our very own Roger, suffered minor cuts and bruises to his face and splattered bird parts across the inside of the aircraft. This is what Ian Gregor of the FAA spokesperson indicated to the journalist that was writing the article. That was Dan Marys of KOLD News. But when I read that, and after talking to you, there's such a disconnect of what really happened. And I mean, that just sounds like, oh, a bird went through the window and oh yeah, okay. But give it to us. Let me hear it. What, in your words, I remember you telling me about it, and you woke up that morning, you were running a little bit behind schedule. You didn't get your contacts in, so you threw your glasses on and you just made it to the airport on time, and it was a beautiful day to fly, right?
The most succinct way to put it, I thought I was going to die. I honestly thought it was all over. Doing the job that I did, we had early morning flying, and so I would typically have to be at the airport around 5 o'clock in the morning or so, and we would launch between 6 and 6:30 in the morning, and then we'd come back later in the evening. But this one was a departure from Phoenix International Airport. It was Yep, but 10 years ago, about to the day, launched typical November day out of Phoenix, clear, cool. Was flying about 120-mile, I think, flight or so from Phoenix out to Furlough. It had been uneventful, and I had just started the descent into Furlough Airport, which is an uncontrolled field, no tower. I was not talking to air traffic control or anyone at that point. I had just made a call on the CTAF, the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, letting the airport and the airport environment and anyone else in the area know, where I was coming from, about 20 miles out to the west. And then it was like a bomb had gone off in the airplane. I did not know what happened. As it was, I had made that call on the traffic frequency, and another airplane had just departed, and he was headed back towards Phoenix. He was climbing through 8,500 feet or something. I was descending at 11,000 feet. We were separated by about 20 miles, but when you're at about 11,000 feet, what do you hit? You hit airplanes. And so, initially, I had no idea what had happened. I thought I must have hit this other airplane. I remember just kind of thinking, it's over. This is how it's going to end. And I remember looking out the right window, thinking, just expecting to see the ground hurtling towards me, and how my wife was going to be upset that I died without telling her. And it's amazing how fast your brain works. I can tell this story that can take, 10 minutes. And in reality, all these thoughts are going through my mind, and in split seconds. But I looked out the window and it looked normal. And then I worked my way from the right side of the airplane, and I came across to the instrument stack, and all of the instruments were reading the same just like they should. And then I kept moving from the instruments, and then I got to the front windscreen right in front of me, and there was a big gaping hole at the top portion of the windscreen, and the rest of it was completely opaque from the glass shattering. And I saw a tuft of feathers that got caught kind of right where the windscreen was and the fuselage of the airplane. And that's when it hit me and it clicked. Oh, okay, I must have hit a bird. And then all of a sudden, after that realization, that's when things started. I realized I was hurt. There was blood everywhere. I remember at that point, my head hurt, and I put my hand up to my head, and I thought half my head was gone. It was just a warm, bloody, matted mess on my head. My hand was covered in blood. There was glass and blood all over the place. Like you had mentioned, it was a 5 o'clock, we had a 5 o'clock show at the airport in the morning, and I didn't always put my contacts in. And this particular morning, I had put my glasses on, and my glasses were gone. I had no idea where my glasses were. It was loud as all get out. My headset was gone. And then all of a sudden it's kind of like, okay, well, that operation and a lot of 135 cargo operations, it's single pilot. And I was myself. And I remember I distinctly remember sitting there after all this had happened, and thinking to myself, well, Roger, there's nobody else here. You better fly the damn plane. And that's when the adrenaline started kicking in. And, I think looking back on it, that I'm pretty proud of myself for doing the things that I did. After landing is kind of a different story, but, there I was. We didn't have GPS in those airplanes. We didn't have autopilot in those airplanes. And so I was flying along, hurt with a terrible headache. I wasn't sure how much blood was, how much was the birds.
Right. I mean, that's amazing. Just, you kept it together. the whole time.
Yeah.
You kind of reasoned through it logically. You kept it together, and so you couldn't see forward. How did you land the airplane?
Well, by the time I got to landing, it was okay. By the time I actually figured out where I was, I found the airport within an ADF and an NDB, and I ended up kind of winding up on a 45 to a right downwind entry, and that was all okay because at that point, when you're flying, and I was in the right traffic pattern, you're looking out the right side of the airplane, and it was about 500 feet after I was on final that things kind of started to go sideways again. You know, that's when I kind of lost a little bit of the visual, but you still have the front right windscreen, and you get to the ground, the more you can see out of all the other windows. I was a little worried. I remember getting close to touchdown, and I balked at it a little bit, and I pulled back on the yoke. And I didn't add any power. And again, that's one of those things that I distinctly remember going through my mind. And it was, what, Roger? So it's going to be better the next time you do this? And I took the power levers and I pulled it back to the stop, and I pitched back, and then I just waited. And I touched down. That the stall warning horn did go off. I would touch down a little bit left of center line. And at that point, I knew it was over. And that's when that release of adrenaline happened. And I was on landing rollout, and I just started bawling. And things kind of got I kind of lost a little bit of my focus at that point after getting the plane to the ramp, mostly because I knew at that point that I was going to live. Because up until that point, I really wasn't sure what was going to happen.
Yeah. And you were able not only to get the airplane off the runway, but you continued your taxi to the tie down. Is that right?
I continued the taxi to the ramp. As it turned out, I parked the plane someplace different than I thought I had. And then I also couldn't for the life of me figure out how I was supposed to turn the airplane off. I remember there was a firefighters outside, waiting for me to emerge because, they saw this big gaping hole. But all I remember thinking is, oh, well, I'm gonna kill the firefighters because I can't figure out how to turn the airplane off.
Oh my God!
I was kind of a mess after landing. But up until that point, when people ask about emergencies and how you're going to respond, I've now had that experience that even in an emergency, like, I have full confidence that I will be able to at least keep my cool because I've lived.
Yeah.
I've done it. I thought I was going to die. There was nobody else there. I was not like I could talk to anybody else. My headset was gone. I mean, I have no communications. I'm injured. 18 stitches in my head. There's blood, glass. I can't see, and I kept it together. And I think that's the most important thing. In the end, I think that's the most important thing is just being able to keep your cool so that you can at least be able to logically think through some of the things that, do happen in airplanes from time to time.
And, it's funny that you said that because over the years, I've read many stories and articles about how, aviators in general, at least career aviators that have been doing it long enough, have a little bit of experience behind their belt. They wanted to see the stress patterns of pilots. So they would put them in the cockpit and they had hooked them up to, all kinds of equipment to see if their heart rate can get higher, their blood pressure would go higher, and they would throw emergencies at them in the simulator. And after just time and time again, throwing the worst possible scenarios at them, these pilots, their heart rates elevated a little, but they never really got into that stress level, and they had to scrap the study from what I understand from reading from that article. I'll try to find it and see if I can put it in the show notes. But and it sounds like from what you're telling us that you really kind of went through the same thing, and you kind of logically kind of just pieced it together, kept it together. You absolutely performed just amazingly to get that airplane safely on the ground, to keep yourself as safe as possible after such an emergency. And to see these photos, it's just amazing. And And I read the NTSB report a little earlier again as I was prepping for this interview, and even the NTSB report, it just is a testament to how much you kept it together. And hey, good job, man. I've said it 100 times to you, but man, it's so impressive that you've lived through that and you were able to pull that off like that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's one of those things that, I'm sure you've heard it before. The job of a pilot is years of boredom punctuated by moments of terror.
Right.
That's part of the job. And in the end, the pay, the job of a pilot isn't what we do generally on an everyday basis. It's for when those things outside the scope of normal procedures that's what we train for, and that's the expectation.
Yeah, that's that one flight that may have happened to you in the last 5 years. All the other flights are they're great, they're fine, but that one flight, that's where you earned your entire salary for those 5 years.
Yep.
And that's really what it all boils down to. And that's what you're getting into when you decide, oh, I want to go fly airplanes for a living. But your story doesn't end there, does it? You did some more flying after you recuperated from such an ordeal. And, I remember you were being interviewed by not just local news agencies, but also the Associated Press. And, you had some time off. And as soon as you were medically cleared and you were able to come back to the flight line, you did some time at Ameriflight. And then you got the call, didn't you?
Then I got the call back from ExpressJet that things had started turning around, and ExpressJet was bringing everybody back, and it was at that point that I was, I a couple years ago or years before I had no job, and at this point I had two jobs, and I was going to have to make a decision on whether I was going to, which path I was going to go. Stay at Ameriflight, where by that time I had a fairly decent schedule, or go back to the airlines, especially since going back to my original first story was I was getting that turbine PIC time.
Right.
But in the end, I did decide that going back to ExpressJet was going to be the better course, the better option for me. And so I went back to ExpressJet.
Yeah, and you were based, was it Chicago for a while?
Initially, after I first went back, I was based out of Chicago, O'Hare, doing the commute, which I know you know well.
Yeah.
So I was going up to Chicago, and eventually I did that. I guess it was probably maybe 8 months, because I remember I did a summer and I did a winter and then a summer out of O'Hare, which was plenty for me. And then I did a base transfer down to Houston, which is where I spent the duration of my career at ExpressJet for the next 3 years.
And correct me if I'm wrong, didn't you get offered an upgrade at your time at ExpressJet at some point?
No, I never got the option to upgrade. Even when I left after I was coming up on my 5-year anniversary, I was still a couple hundred numbers away from upgrade, which is one of the reasons that I actually chose to leave at the time, was just because the progression was taking too long.
So you finally made it back to a regional with this idea of, spending some time there as an FO, then, getting your quality of life a little bit better by getting to an airport that was a little bit easier commute for you, and then hoping to upgrade, hoping to get in the left seat, earn a little bit more money, have a quality of life improve for you. But that just didn't happen fast enough, and some exciting news happened during that time as well, when you had not one but two little ones come into your world, not at the same time, but within a few years of each other, correct?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of hoping there going on at my career at the regionals, and during that time I did I had two kids, and again there was just a confluence of things that happened that negatively impacted how I how I wanted to live, maybe. Um, there was the Colgan accident that I don't know if you've talked about before, but it had a pretty sizable, at least a marked impact on the industry, especially at the regional airlines. And I had just had a couple kids, and then what happened was when the FAR 117, I think it's 117, the new rest rules came out, and I was, I think we had probably maybe 3,000 pilots or so at that point in time. I was only a couple hundred, 200 or 300 numbers away from upgrade. So I was a fairly senior FO at the time. I did have a decent schedule. I was commuting. I could bid and hold commutable trips relatively easily, and I would regularly have 14 or 15 days off. But then after is January of 2014, as I recall, that the new rest rules came out, and the bid packets starting in 2014, I was going from being able to credit, in 90 hours and only working 15 or 16 days a month to all of a sudden, even at my pretty senior FO status, I was now minimum days off, having minimum days off, which was 12 at that company at the time. So I've got minimum days off. I've lost 3 days off, and now my credit line is 75 hours. I am literally working more or being gone more in order to get paid.
Right. And were
less.
those lines, to add insult to injury, they weren't even commutable, were they?
And there was a lot fewer the commutable lines, because what was happening was that, we lost productivity in the trips, because in order to meet the rest requirements, well, basically that just says you can't fly. And instead of flying during this time, we need you to rest. But that's going, which I understand and appreciate the spirit of. It just, the way that it worked in my life from a practical standpoint, it really destroyed my quality of life. And like you just brought up, I had just had a couple, I had just had my son, and I'm now gone more. I'm not seeing my kids. I'm getting paid less. Again, I'm getting hit by this what I perceived as this perfect storm of, really it was just some unfortunate events. But I decided that I was going to try and look to see if there was something else out there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all these scenarios were happening, beyond your control, that were reducing your quality of life yet again. I mean, you saw it happening with the furlough, and, having to go work back up in Sacramento as a river rafting guide because you had to make ends meet. And then, things got a little bit better. You found that Ameriflight job. You spent time there. You started getting your turbine PIC time. Then you had the bird strike incident that could have been a disaster, but thank God that it wasn't, and you were able to see through that, and things got better. And then, hey, here's a decision to go to a regional carrier because this seems to be the right way to do it, to get the 121 experience. And then, as you mentioned, the Colgan crash. Now, I haven't talked about the Colgan crash. Most people in the United States do realize what we're talking about, but just in case they didn't, Colgan Air Flight 3407 was marked as a Continental Connection airplane or air flight, and it crashed in Buffalo, New York on Thursday, February 12th of 2009. The NTSB report that came out soon after was very damaging to the flight crew. They marked it as pilot error, and it was awful. And this happened really shortly after the miracle on the Hudson flight. And for a period of time, being an aviator in this country, I can remember, just walking around the airport or heading to a hotel, and people would pat me on the back saying, "Oh yeah, that's Sully, man. He did a great job. He saved all those lives. And, thanks for doing all that you do." And I'm, "Oh, okay. I'm just a, young pilot at a regional. I'm not a legacy Airbus pilot, but okay, thanks, appreciate that." And that happened, that lasted like 2 weeks, maybe a little longer. I'm not sure exactly the dates, but, and then this Colgan crash happened. And then when the news came out, what caused the accident, and depending who you talk to, if they say it's lack of experience or pilots that, I don't want to say anything bad or negative or be a Monday morning quarterback here, but the crash happened. It wasn't good. It was pilot error, and Congress actually was the one that initiated kind of an emergency decree we need to change these rest rules. We need to make it so that pilots need more time before they can operate in an airline environment. They need the minimum 1,500 hours and an ATP before you can even be a first officer, where before that wasn't the case. A 121 operator, as long as you had a commercial pilot license and you had passed your ATP written, and you could get a job at a regional airline. And so, they had different standards of hours, but really there was no regulated hours to get a job. Then FAR 117 came out, the regulation that indicated that we needed to have a minimum of 1,500 hours. And there are some exceptions to that with restricted ATPs if you qualify under certain programs. But you had to have 1,500 hours minimum and an ATP license in your hand before you can even be a first officer. So again, that combined with the rest rule requirements that increased, which really, helps us in some ways, depending on the scenario. I can tell you some horror stories because of 117 and how we now can fly more than 8 hours in a day. But, this really changed quality of life for a lot of aviators. Not so much at the legacy carriers, because their contracts are usually a little bit more ironclad, and they have a lot more protections with minimum days, minimum duty regs, so they get paid a minimum hours per day. Doesn't matter if you fly 1 hour or if you fly the 5. I think at Legacy Airlines where I'm working, it's 5.25 or 5 hours and 15 minutes per day. So it doesn't matter what I fly, as long as if I'm a 3-day trip, I'm going to get paid 5.25 times 3 minimum, or whatever I fly if it's over. So quality of life for a long period of time at the regionals, especially in the wake of the FAR 117 requirement, did decrease. And that's what Roger's talking about. So you were able to hang on to that job for a little longer, but the quality of life was diminishing. You had 2 babies at home that you were missing out on being there. So you made a decision to increase your quality of life. And how did you do that?
Like I had said, I had, because of all those things that we had just been talking about, I decided to explore whether there were other options out there. Whether, it's life should be better than this. What other options do I have? And as it so happened, I came across a business very close to my house that did King Air instruction, and I went down there and I ended up getting a job as a King Air instructor, which was a ground-based position. We did basically insurance-mandated classes. The King Air, most models of King Air, with the exception of one of them, are under 12,500 pounds. They don't require any type rating. And as far as the FAA is concerned, they're just another multi-engine airplane, just like Seminole. But insurance companies did mandate, because it's a high-powered turbine airplane. Insurance companies would mandate annual courses, and so the company that I ended up working at was a ground-based position. We taught recurrent classes, we taught initial classes. We'd spend the morning in the classroom doing ground school, and we would do afternoon simulator sessions. And when I say simulator, it's not the full motion fancy simulators that most people might think of. It was just basically a static advanced aircraft training device is actually what it was, which was a full mock-up of a full functioning King Air, but basically just ran off of computers and was non-motion with some screen setup, some pretty sizable screen setup for visuals. And I was I did it. I was all contract. So I could work or I could not work if I happened to be doing something else. At that point, it was kind of, here, there's a class. Can you teach it? Well, yes, I can. But I kind of did the math on it, and I figured I could be home and I could make about the same amount of money doing that, being home every night as I was making even coming up on 5 years at ExpressJet. And so I decided to make that jump for for my psyche, for my family. And, I kind of can look back and think, where things might have been had I not done that. But fortunately, it's one of the things that I think I made a good choice with, because that time that my kids were that young and having that 4 or 5 years home with them during their formative years, I actually am happy and think that I did do the right thing. And I actually I enjoyed it.
Yeah. And you are able to get a lot of type ratings out of this too, because over the years that the past few years, especially, your current employer is buying jets, and how many type ratings do you have now?
I have 4 type ratings now. And none of them really, they're not through that job, but what I was able to do is I met people. I taught people for 4 years that came in for a 2-day or a 4-day or a 3-day or however many class. And that's it. And I met a whole lot of people. And over the course of time, I got job offers all the time. None of them really ones that I wanted to explore, but what obviously turned out kind of towards the end was I got a job offer with somebody local. Hey, they came in, they had bought a King Air, and they came in for initial training, and the owner had 2 airplanes. He had this King Air that they were coming in to learn, and he also had a Lear 60, and they liked me. The owner liked me. He said, "Hey, we do a lot of flying. I've got this King Air. I need help flying the King Air. We've got this Lear. I need help flying. The Lear is a 2-pilot airplane. Do you think you might be interested in that?" And at that point, after 4 years, I was, I'm a pilot. I was kind of starting to get the itch a little bit. I had done some flying, during those 4 years that I was teaching also, but not very much. And that itch kind of started to come back. And I was like, maybe getting back into flying and flying a jet, and this could be all right. And so I decided to make the jump, and I started flying this guy's King Air and his Lear jet. And then there was another guy that also had a Lear 60. And so I was flying for this other guy that had a Lear 60. And then the one guy that had a Lear 60 bought a Falcon 50. And so then I got a Falcon 50 type rating. And then they went to a Falcon 2000, and I got a Falcon 2000 type rating. And it just kind of kept snowballing from there. Kind of getting your foot in the door. I had a little bit of a different experience. I kind of had a rather rapid progression in the corporate world that can't last forever. And even right now, I'm kind of starting to bump up against the ceiling, which I understand and which is okay. But it's just meeting people, which that teaching job allowed me to do. And then I just take the opportunities as they were coming. Hey, you want to fly this?
Yeah.
Well, sure. Well, you want to go and fly this? Well, absolutely.
I mean, what kind of questions are those? You ask a pilot, "Hey, you want to fly a bigger, faster airplane?" Yeah, okay.
Let me think about that. Okay.
So what's next for you? Because here you are. You're mentioning that you're kind of getting to that point where you've been doing this a little bit, and the returns are there, but there's no progression. So what's the goal, at least? Let's put it that way.
That's a great question. I ask myself that all the time. I'm fortunate enough that I have made it to this point where things are okay. I'm mostly involved in the corporate world now. I do have several type ratings. My job title is, I am a captain with type ratings primarily in. I fly a Falcon 2000 and a Falcon 7X primarily now. The corporate world is good. There's some advantages to that, but it's also, much more at the whims of much
Sure.
fewer people. And so, you kind of get into the corporate world knowing that you're going to have more jobs than say the path that you're on, where you're at your legacy airlines, and I'd be willing to bet that you're going to be at legacy airlines until you decide it's
That's
time to
been the
hang it up.
goal.
In the corporate world, and it's a much different animal in the corporate world, and so you're always kind of wondering what's going to happen next. I don't know. I think that I keep taking the opportunities as they come. I have to admit that the airline world does have job security and benefits that still are better than most of the corporate world. I'm sure that you've talked about or will talk about the pilot shortage.
No, not yet, but
There's
that is
kind of
definitely on the horizon on topics to share.
there's kind of a pilot shortage, but there's only a pilot shortage on those jobs that that not as many people want to do. And there will never be a shortage of pilots for the jobs that everybody wants to do. And that's the same in the corporate world, whether that's at your Delta Americans and Uniteds of the world, or flying in the corporate world where, hey, we fly about 6 or 7 days a month, and the rest of the time, you're off. Those jobs will always have plenty of job applicants for them. In the end, if I can get that kind of job in the corporate world, that'd be great. But those jobs are much fewer and farther between. Would it be great to get into the legacies? That'd be great too. It's pick your poison, and kind of knowing that there's no quick fix to it. There's no quick way to do it. You got to put your time in, and just take the opportunities as they come.
Yeah. Well, there is a looming shortage on the horizon, and there, we haven't really dove into it yet in Squawk Ident, but definitely going to be talking about it in the future. As you're talking about this, I just looked up a quick article from The Conversation. It's an online article that talks about the national shortage of pilots. Now, they're not canceling flights at legacy carriers or major carriers right now because they can't find people to operate them. Where they are finding it hard to operate on a regular basis because of pilots is at the regional scale. And it's because where's a legacy pilot going to get, or a legacy carrier going to get a pilot? They're going to go to the experienced pilots. Now, the military, there's not as many pilots coming out of the military as there used to be. And that's simply because more drones are being used nowadays, and drone pilots are, in an air-conditioned room operating in a virtual reality environment. They're not in an aircraft needing, particular ratings and experience and whatnot. And then there's helicopter pilots, which the helicopter pilots, they do have programs out there, but it doesn't translate very well into fixed wing. So you're stuck with pulling from either the corporate world, the cargo world, or the regional world. Well, if you keep pulling from the regional world, you hurt yourself, because if you're contracting out, you're flying to these regional carriers, then you're going to dry up the pool of regional pilots. So regional airlines actually in the past 5-6 years have started really paying attention and paying first year, second year FOs a tremendous amount of money. It's almost doubled in the past 6 years. And according to this article by The Conversation, the U.S. is facing a serious shortage of pilots. This was back in July of 2018 that they issued this. And these numbers are pretty accurate. It says, according to the FAA, there were 827,000 pilots in the U.S. in the year 1987. Over the last 3 decades, that number has decreased by 30%. However, the International Air Transportation Association predicts that over the next 20 years, air travel will double. So we're talking about doubling the amount of airplanes in the air, or air travel. And we've already seen this decrease in trend. And unfortunately, what's going to add insult to injury is the mandatory retirement age. Now, at this very moment, it's at 65. That went up from 60 to 65 back in 2009. And that was in an effort to prevent this shortage. And that kind of put everybody, as you mentioned earlier, as that economic downturn happened, this happened as well. And it really prevented retirements from happening, which meant the progression of a pilot was now delayed 5 years automatically because people could fly longer. Well, I'm looking at the charts here. 2020, they're looking at over 2,000 pilots are going to have to retire mandatory at the American Airlines, all the American airlines that are out there. In 2022, it goes up to 2,600 pilots, then 2,700 the year after, 2,800. So we're talking over 20,000 pilots are going to have to retire in the next 10 years. And where are we going to get them from? If we keep pulling from the regionals, well, the regionals aren't going to be able to sustain their current hub and spoke system. So something's going to have to happen. And what we're seeing now is opportunity for growth. And at this point, Roger, I really hope that whatever path you decide to take or whatever path presents itself to you, that you're able to get into something that's going to be able to sustain a decent quality of life. It's going to minimize your time away from family, and that is going to give you the growth progression that you want, because you do have a very long career ahead of you. And with your experience, your just professionalism, I mean, airlines recruitments out there, if you're listening, you'd be a fool not to hire this guy. I mean, he's got some great tales to tell, and he's made some great decisions. I mean, he needs to be managing a flight department at a legacy airline in the future.
Well, I don't know about that.
So we've talked a little bit about your entire aviation history here this evening, and this has been a wonderful trip to come along with you and hear of your struggles, of your journey. And I know we've only really scratched the surface, haven't we?
Yeah, there's, I'm just like you, I'm sure can attest to, there's, you go through this in this industry for a couple decades, and there's a lot of stories.
Yes, there are. And, we're running out of time. We actually went a little over. We were having so much fun here. But I would love to have you back on the show. What do you think?
That'd be great. It was a great experience. Thanks you so much for having me.
Yeah, in the ideal scenario, I thought, who am I going to have on? Oh, it's got to be Roger. With the incidents that you've had, the struggles that you've had, we really have had two separate paths, and I've struggled as well. I know we joke around about it now that we look back, but I've been fortunate with my career path. I've been struggling in other ways, and you've been kind of struggling with your career path. And though you have a great job, I know you love doing what you're doing, and flying in the corporate world is absolutely can be just invigorating with the flexibility and the schedules, and flying into some destinations that I'm sure most airline guys don't get to do.
Yeah, that you guys would never see. Taking in an airplane the size of the planes that we fly, and and do a 50-foot wide strip somewhere, which is actually something that we're going to be doing in not too long.
Yeah. So I usually start my show with like where I was the week before, or if I'm in the middle of a trip and doing a remote, I'll talk about the trip so far. How can you share with us just a little bit about what you're in the middle of as about a week-long trip now?
Yeah, I'm on a week-long trip. This one hasn't been entirely too exciting. Actually, we've just kind of had to get some maintenance done, and then we'll be flying some passengers for the next few days. We started out in the Southern California area, and then we flew out to Houston, where the corporate world's a lot different than the airline world. You guys fly a lot more than we do. We flew out and landed in Houston, and I sat for for 2 days, basically, for about 48 hours. And then just this evening, we made the long flight from Houston to Austin, Texas. Unfortunately, we had to go into Houston Intercontinental this time, which is something we don't normally go to. And the reason why is because we actually spent more time taxiing to the runway in Houston today than we did in the air getting from Houston to Austin.
Yep. I've been there many times.
But the weather in Houston was not so good. Fortunately, it was a help that I had been based in Houston for so long, actually, because we had the longest possible taxi that you can get in Houston today, and we spent 35 minutes just getting to the runway for takeoff. And then so I'm here in Austin. I'm sitting here for 24 hours, and then we're gonna do a flight to West Texas, and then spend a night there, up to Chicago to spend a night in Chicago, and then fly back to West Texas for probably another night there, and then we'll go back home to Southern California. It's very rare. If we fly 2 legs in a day, that's a busy day for us.
Yeah. Well, you definitely have a different schedule than someone in the airline community. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today. I want to just spend a moment and just say thank you so much for not only coming on a Squawk Ident and sharing your stories with me and with our listeners here, and also just for all that you do. I mean, you're hanging in there, you are living your best life you can, and you're out there training people how to fly airplanes, flying in a corporate world, which my hat's off to you, because you're doing it all. I've got dispatchers and operation controls and weathermen that are sitting there in an SOC saying, "Oh yeah, well you might want to. We're going to reroute you." I mean, in the middle of flying, you're getting ACARS messages going, "We're going to suggest that you request a reroute here because there's some weather ahead." What do I have to do? Okay, sure, no problem. But you're in it. You're filing flight plans, and you're it. You're your own operation control, dispatcher, captain, first officer. Dare I even say your own flight attendant? You got to take care of your passengers. You don't have any flight attendants on board, right?
We do not have any flight attendants, and that's another big difference. All those things that you were talking about between the airline and the corporate world is, yeah, we are our dispatchers. We are we stock the airplane, we clean the airplane, we fly the airplane, and set up transportation for passengers, set up our own hotels. There's a lot more work outside of the airplane in the corporate world.
Yeah, well, my hat is tipped to you, sir. I want to thank you for being on the show today. I wish you clear skies.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And you know what? Let's have you back on. We're gonna talk off the air here and try to figure out what's next and what schedules are like, because I can see this as being a great way to discuss the struggles in aviation. The struggle is real, all the topics that I usually talk about. And it's great to have perspective from another side of the industry.
Well, thanks very much, Tony. I appreciate it. And I had a great time. I look forward to being back sometime.
Wonderful. And when you get back, we'll definitely get together and share an IPA or two.
You got it. Sounds great.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Our very first interview with a wonderful individual, Captain Roger. This has been an absolute treat to be able to have a conversation about how the struggle of becoming an aviator in this modern industry can actually be a completely different road from one pilot to the next. And I'd also like to take this opportunity and thank all the listeners out there that tune in to the Squawk Ident podcast. Every episode is unique in its own way, and I do my very best to bring some interesting content for you. And one way that I can continue to do that is if I get some feedback from you. So please don't hesitate to send me feedback, email, voice message, however you want to do it. And maybe you have a topic that you'd like us to talk about on the show. Remember, you can find us at www.av8r-tony.com. That's Alpha Victor 8 Romeo Tango Oscar November Yankee.com. Or you can just drop us a line from whatever format you're listening to, whatever app you might be listening to this podcast. Also, you can send us emails directly at aviatortony@gmail.com. So, again, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to this grateful aviator. Keep the dirty side down, be safe, and take care of each other.